So thank you very much for being here. Hello to everybody. I will talk about SidaTim. The full name of this project is Novel Pathways of Biomass Production, assessing the potential of Sida, hermaphrodita, and valuable timber trees. And this is also where the name of our project comes from. Sida and timber form that acronym SidaTim. So you can see we are dealing with many different and heterogeneous topics which make this a very interesting project. The objective of our project was and still is to strengthen the bio-based economy by researching and promoting first, innovative multi-purpose plant species. I've mentioned already Sida hermaphrodita, but we have also included Silphium perfoliatum and some short rotation coppice plants as a comparison. And then more generally, we want to assess novel agriculture and management approaches, and this is where the trees and the timber comes into play. And we are a research consortium of 6 partners which are located where the red dots are. Okay, so because this is a heterogeneous project, we focused on 2 research pillars. Research pillar 1 concerns the mentioned crops, not annual, but crops. We assess economic and ecological potentials and aspects of Sida and of Silphium. And in our second research pillar, we are concerned with the impacts and with the above ground carbon sequestration potential of trees in an agricultural setting. That means agroforestry systems. And finally, we aim at merging these 2 pillars, for example, by modeling the economic aspects and management practices of growing these 2 types of plants together, when taking, for example, the shadow tolerance of Sida and Silphium into account. Okay. Yeah, that's just something with modeling. Some key scientific findings. These are the 2 plants, Sida and Silphium, and we established experimental plots in the involved project countries. This is just an example from our experimental plots in Poland, located in Lipnik. And we used, for example, 2 different provenances of Sida hermaphrodita, and we also combined 2 different establishment methods. We used seeds and we also planted seedlings. So by performing these types of variations, we were able to compare different establishment possibilities. And we also grew Silphium perfoliatum in these experimental sites in the different countries. So this is just an example from the yields of year 2 and the second year of establishment. And now we are very curious what the especially dry year 2018 has done to our plants on our experimental plots and how they performed in comparison to other plants and also short rotation coppice. Okay, we also performed harvests, of course, of these plants to determine different kinds of combustion parameters, like also ash melting points, ash contents, calorific values, and so on. But we also used these plant materials to perform biogas and methane measurements or production measurements, as you can see here, for example. And so far it turned out that these plants are not as effective as, for example, corn with regard to biogas production, but because you plant them only once and harvest them for a number of years, very similar to miscanthus, there's still the possibility that in the long term, or from an economic perspective, that makes sense for the farmer, in contrast to planting corn each year and investing a lot of workload and money each year. Okay, coming now to a research pillar 2. What we've done here, for example, is we scanned trees like this. These are pruned trees because we are interested in producing long branch-free boles that we can sell on the timber market for several hundred, perhaps thousands of euros, depending on how good the quality of the stem wood is. We scanned those trees in winter, and then we developed software tools in which we can simulate the annual leaf growth dynamics and also leaf senescence dynamics to be able to then calculate the shadow projection of such trees onto the floor and the ground below them, or in other words, onto the crops below them, if we grow these trees in an agricultural setting. So we can then calculate the annual, or whatever, the solar energy sum. In this case, it's the annual reduction of solar energy on the floor, ground beneath those trees, but we can calculate these values for 10 minutes intervals for any time of any year that we want to, and we can also feed factual weather data derived from, for example, the German weather stations into this model. And we also, by generating these kinds of three-dimensional tree models using terrestrial laser scans, we can also determine the carbon sequestration potential of trees. This again is relevant in our kind of agroforestry settings. So our partners in Italy, among other issues, they performed a GIS-based study on model regions in central Italy. These are farms, and this is the arable land and forest land located on these farms. So we identified tree rows that exist already on these farms. This is one example. And then again, for example, in this tree row, we also, we had transects running away from these tree rows, in which we analyzed the harvest of the crops grown on the neighboring fields. In this case, it's a wheat field. So we quantified the amount and also the length of these tree rows in our model regions. And regarding the yield effects, we can say that it was a very ambiguous result, but that's not too bad, because it seems that in central Italy, for example, the shadow of the tree does not necessarily reduce the crop growth, but because of the shading, it might reduce transpiration, evapotranspiration, so that in fact the yield was not lower in the shadow of these trees as compared to the fully exposed areas of such a field. And this is still work in progress. We want to finish our carbon sequestration model, in which we then can upscale the amount of carbon stored in a single tree to, let's say, a tree rows of our model region. So these are things that might be relevant for policy and so on. Okay, turning now to policy relevant findings. Sida and Silphium again, step backward to our crops. They are neophytes in Europe. They originate in Northern America. That means we need to test and see how they behave in European growth conditions. For example, this is a cedar field in late summer, and you can see here I marked it with red circles. The plants seem to spread into the surroundings. So we, of course, need to check whether that's dangerous, whether it invades native plant species communities. So we performed pot experiments, also again in Italy, using different kind of seed mixtures, growing it together with cedar and seeing how cedar behaves. And in this case, it turned out cedar was not very competitive, luckily. And we also performed greenhouse experiments with cedar and exposed it to drought stress and checked the reactions and so on. So the good news is, even you do find individuals of cedar plants in the surrounding of established sites. They don't seem to be very invasive. That's so far no danger, which is good. We also assessed other ecosystem services in terms of ecology in Sida and Silphium plants. Now here the pollinating insects on different field sites. We documented their abundance and the visiting patterns of these fields. And we also documented, see over here, the biological soil quality index refers to the soil arthropods in the soil below plants. So we compared it with corn, Silphium, cedar, poplar, short rotation coppice, and also forest soil. And you see that cedar, for example, and all plants perform better than corn, but you also need to be reminded that these experimental sites are only 2 years old, so it would be very interesting to follow further how the soil arthropods develop in our field sites. Okay. So as for policies in Germany, or at least in Lower Saxony, our, okay, thank you, results caught the interest of policymakers. So they say, okay, what those guys do with the Sida and Silphium needs to be done in future on all neophytes that are tested in Lower Saxony. So I think this is a very good approach. And we also managed to include Sida, hermaphrodita, into the greening program in which it was not contained before. Practical findings, yeah, we did collect some experience, notably with establishing our experimental sites regarding the treatment of seeds and seedlings. You have to use fresh ones, I can tell you, otherwise they won't grow well. And the seeds still can be an option even for Sida if you apply specific treatments to those seeds beforehand, which was done in another project we are in good contact with, so it still can be an option, and this would reduce the establishment costs very notably, as it is already the case with Silphium. So if you have the choice between establishing plantations using seeds or seedlings, better choose the seeds if possible. We also assessed whether it would make sense to harvest 2 times for a biogas production, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It's not worth it in terms of workload and also economy. And we want to summarize all these practical findings into management guidelines for Sida, for which there is at present no management guideline, and we then want to translate it also into all the languages of our project countries. Okay, some innovative solutions. This is work in progress. We analyze the fiber contents of Sida. Sida has about 13% of very fine single fibers, which is very peculiar. Other fiber plants such as hemp and linen, they have fiber bundles, so they are much more coarse. And these fine fibers of Sida might well be used as additives in biopolymer compounds. And we are also in contact with companies that test the possibility to use Sida wood chips or Sida chips as a substitute for turf, because turf becomes increasingly difficult to produce it, mainly for reasons of environment protection. Okay, we also produced several publications in scientific journals, but also in proceedings of conferences, of which we attended quite a few. This is just a selection. Next steps, here we want to spread our results to our target group some more. As I told you before, there's also still some work in progress. We want to produce some more scientific publication and the mentioned management guidelines. We also plan to do some more workshops in which we are also addressing practitioners. For example, there will be one workshop in January next year in Spelle in Germany. This is in Lower Saxony. And there will also be one more workshop in spring in Italy. And just in September, we met in Lipnik with about 30 to 40 interested people from science and the farming communities, and also collaborated a bit with Ms. Gomar and invited people of this project, Marta has just told you about it, to present some of their results. Okay, many people worked in SidaTim, so I'd like to thank them all without now reading each single name, but I'd like to mention one person, Professor Henryk Cisz. He played an important role in establishing SidaTim in Poland, but unfortunately he unexpectedly died in April, which was a sad loss for our project. I want also to thank you, the team from FACCE SURPLUS, especially Nicolas and Heather and all the others, but of course also all our funding agencies. In Germany, this is the Bundesministerium für Ernährung und Landwirtschaft und der Projektträger Bundesanstalt für Landwirtschaft und Ernährung. Okay, so now I thank you for your attention, and that's it.